Chapter 8. The Frost of Death. Liara stood motionless, her crimson-trimmed armor catching the faint glow of dawn. Before her loomed Aldric, or what had once been him. His silver-plated armor was tarnished, streaked with crimson and darkened with unholy corruption. His hollow gaze locked onto hers, empty yet mocking. Green tendrils of aura swirled around him, the remnants of his once holy power now twisted into something vile and unnatural. This was no longer Commander Aldric. This was a Death Knight. A Death Knight was a mockery of life, a being caught between the mortal plane and undeath. Their holy energy, meant to heal and protect, was corrupted into unholy power. Aldric's once radiant aura had shifted to a sickly green, pulsating like a living disease. His sword, once a beacon of divine justice, now emanated a cold, malevolent glow, its edge dripping with frost. Even his presence felt oppressive, as though the very air around him was choking with despair. "Hello, Liara," Aldric said, his voice smooth yet chilling, like a whisper carried on a frozen wind. "There's no point in continuing this fight. Come with me to the other side. Embrace the inevitable." Liara's breath caught, her fingers tightening around the hilt of her blade. She wanted to speak, to scream, but the weight of his words, and the man he had once been, stilled her tongue. Then, like a distant echo, another voice broke through. "No, Liara." Aldric's voice, trembling and filled with anguish, seemed to come from deep within him. "You must fight. Don't give in. Don't let him win." The duality of his words sent a shiver through her. Tears pricked her eyes as she struggled to reconcile the two voices, the man she had revered and the monster before her. She began, her voice faltering. But then she gritted her teeth, raising her blade. Her eyes burned with determination. "You are not the same. I will release Aldric's soul from your grasp." Aldric let out a low chuckle, his unholy aura flaring as he raised his corrupted blade. "Foolish paladin, let me show you the futility of your faith." Their swords clashed with a deafening roar, divine light meeting unholy frost. Sparks of golden and green energy lit up the battlefield as their strikes sent shockwaves rippling through the air. Liara fought with everything she had, her strikes precise and relentless. But Aldric's movements were methodical, his strikes cold and calculated. Each swing of his blade left a trail of frost in its wake, the air growing colder with every clash. As the battle raged, Aldric extended his free hand, dark energy swirling around his fingers. He muttered an incantation, and skeletal warriors clawed their way from the earth. "Go!" Aldric commanded, his voice like the grinding of ice. The skeletons obeyed, their hollow eyes fixed on the High Priestess's chamber. Liara's heart raced. "No!" she cried, breaking away from Aldric and sprinting after them. The skeletons moved swiftly, their clawed hands reaching for the chamber doors. Liara struck one down, but as she turned to face the others, she stumbled on the uneven ground. She rolled onto her back just as Aldric loomed over her, his blade raised high. Time seemed to slow as the frost-covered edge descended toward her. She rolled out of the way, narrowly avoiding the strike, and scrambled to her feet, continuing her pursuit of the skeletons. The stairs to the chamber loomed ahead, but as she climbed, one of the skeletal warriors turned on her. She dispatched it with a swift strike, but her foot slipped on the icy steps. Before she could recover, Aldric was upon her. His unholy blade struck her side, the cold searing through her armor and into her flesh. Liara gasped, her vision blurring as she collapsed onto the steps. Her blade clattered from her hand as she looked up at him, her breath shallow. Aldric knelt beside Liara, his expression unreadable. "You were strong, Liara," he said softly, almost reverently. "But now your strength belongs to me." Her eyes widened as his blade touched her chest, the frost spreading like veins of ice. Her body stiffened, her wings faltering as their golden light dimmed. Aldric's voice echoed, deep and commanding. "Rise, Liara." Her eyes turned white, frost spreading across her irises as her body convulsed. Slowly she stood, her movements stiff and mechanical. Her once radiant wings were now dark and frost-covered, their edges jagged and cold. She turned to Aldric, her gaze empty yet filled with a cruel mockery of her former self. "Good," Aldric said, his voice tinged with satisfaction. "Now, let us bring an end to this light." But then a piercing scream echoed from the direction of the High Priestess's chamber. Aldric and Liara turned sharply, their gazes locking onto the towering structure. The lone skeleton that had escaped Liara's pursuit reached the altar within the chamber. The High Priestess stood defiant, her staff raised as divine light swirled around her. She struck down one skeleton, but the other lunged, its jagged blade piercing her side. She gasped, stumbling forward as her blood dripped onto the ancient altar. For a moment, silence enveloped the chamber. Then the runes on the altar ignited, their golden light surging upward in a blinding beam that pierced the darkened sky. The skeleton crumbled to ash, its unholy presence consumed by the divine energy. The High Priestess staggered, her strength fading. She leaned heavily on the altar, her bloodied hand clutching its edge. Despite the pain, a serene smile spread across her face as she whispered, "He comes." Her voice was barely audible, yet it resonated through the battlefield. The beam of light grew brighter, its golden glow spreading outward like the first rays of a long-forgotten dawn. Aldric's expression darkened as he watched the beam of light, his grip tightening on his corrupted blade. "No," he hissed, his voice filled with both anger and unease. Liara, now a Death Knight, stood silently beside him, her frost-covered wings catching the eerie glow of the divine light. For a moment, the battlefield seemed to hold its breath, the undead halting their advance as the golden beam illuminated the scene. The High Priestess standing tall despite her mortal wound, her gaze fixed on the heavens as the light enveloped her. The faint outline of a figure, a celestial being with radiant wings, began to form within the beam, signaling the arrival of Michael.